The crystal flute chimed against the silver spoon, silencing 300 guests inside Chicago's Crystal Conservatory. My mother, Angela, smoothed her silk dress and smiled not at the bride. My sister Shelby, who looked like a porcelain doll in $22,000 of custom Dior, but at me. To Shelby, she announced, her voice dripping with that specific, weaponized pity she bad perfected over 3 decades. Who chose love and life, unlike poor Grace, who is sadly still married to her lab. The room did not laugh. It just stared. It was the perfect, public execution of my dignity. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. My pulse did not spike. My hands remained as steady as they are in the OR. I simply reached out and took the microphone from my mother's stunned grip. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. I looked at Shelby, whose smile was frozen in a rictus of panic, and then I scanned the 300 faces waiting for my humiliation. I spoke clearly, my voice level and devoid of emotion. Actually, Mother, I have been married for 8 months. You were all invited. But Shelby shredded the invitations before you ever saw them. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. It sucked the air out of the room. Shelby dropped her fork. My mother blinked, her brain seemingly unable to process a reality where I wasn't the punchline. For years, I had analyzed this dynamic like a tumor under a microscope. Outsiders always ask the same question. Why did you stay silent for 8 months? Why didn't you call? They assume silence is weakness, or worse, submission. But it wasn't. It was survival. It is called the trap of normalized cruelty. In a family system like ours, roles are cast in concrete. Shelby was the face, the beauty, the star, the fragile flower that needed constant watering. I was the brain, the utility, the fixer, the safety net that nobody noticed until it broke. When you are the designated scapegoat, your happiness is perceived as an act of aggression. If I had called my parents 8 months ago to ask why they missed my wedding, they would have twisted the narrative. They would have told me I sent the invites late, or that I was being dramatic, or that I was selfish for expecting them to travel during Shelby's engagement season. They would have forced me to apologize for their absence. So, I stayed silent. I let the cognitive dissonance protect me. They couldn't see my success because acknowledging it would destroy their worldview. They needed me to be the failure so Shelby could be the success. It was a balance sheet I had been balancing for them my entire life. I looked at my sister, sitting there in her custom couture, and I didn't see a bride. I saw a liability I had been subsidizing for a decade. The guests saw a model. I saw the 3 stints in rehab I had paid for quietly so the press wouldn't find out. They saw a socialite. I saw the 5-figure bail money I had wired at 3 in the morning when she got a DUI in Miami. I had been the silent investor in Shelby's public image, pouring my surgeon's salary into the cracks of her chaotic life, keeping the facade smooth and perfect. But the problem with being the invisible support beam is that people forget you are the only thing holding the roof up. They thought I was weak because I was quiet. They didn't realize that I was simply gathering data. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I was waiting for the perfect moment to present the bill. And looking at Shelby's pale, terrified face, I knew the invoice was finally due. Shelby laughed. It was a high-pitched, brittle sound that bounced off the glass walls of the conservatory, desperate to find an echo of support. She shook her head, her diamond earrings catching the light, and looked at the crowd with a practiced expression of pity. She called me delusional. She said I was inventing a marriage to cope with my loneliness. She said the invitation never arrived because it never existed. My mother, Angela, nodded in agreement, her face settling into a mask of disappointed matriarch. They were gaslighting me in real time, rewriting reality to fit the narrative where I was the crazy spinster and Shelby was the victim. It was a strategy that had worked for 20 years. But they had forgotten one critical variable. I am a neurosurgeon. I deal in hard data, in scans, in synaptic pathways that either fire or they do not. And I am also the one who installed their entire smart home system 3 years ago because they could not figure out how to program the thermostat. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to match Shelby's hysteria. I simply walked over to the audio-visual rack in the corner of the room. The sound technician tried to stop me, but I gave him a look that I usually reserve for interns who contaminate a sterile field. He stepped back. I pulled my phone from my clutch and tapped the screen 3 times. I accessed the cloud logs for the residential hub at my parents' estate. I had never revoked my administrative access because, frankly, I knew they would eventually lock themselves out and need me to fix it. I connected to the main speakers. A sharp feedback whine cut through the room, silencing the murmurs. Then, I pressed play. The audio was crisp. It was time-stamped from 8 months ago. Shelby's voice boomed through the Crystal Conservatory, magnified by $50,000 of acoustic engineering. The recording started with the sound of paper tearing. Then, Shelby's voice, clear and mocking. She was talking to her maid of honor. She said, "Look at this. Grace actually thinks she is coming. She thinks she is going to bring some random +1 and ruin my aesthetic." Then came the sound of a mechanical shredder whirring to life. The audio continued. Shelby laughed. It was the same laugh she had just used, but on the recording, it was cruel, not defensive. She commanded the smart assistant. She said, "Set a reminder. Check the mail every day before Mom gets home. If anything comes from Grace, trash it. I am not having her depress everyone with her boring life on my day. Delete her." The recording ended. The silence that followed was heavy, physical. It pressed down on the guests. Shelby stood at the head table, her mouth open, her face draining of color until she looked like a wax figure. The gaslighting had not just failed. It had been incinerated by her own voice. My mother looked at Shelby, then at me, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrible realization. They could spin a story. They could not spin a cloud log. I disconnected my phone and looked at my sister. She wasn't a bride anymore. She was a vandal who had been caught red-handed, destroying the only bridge she had left. The guests were frozen, their eyes darting between the head table and the screens, trying to calculate the social fallout of what they had just heard. Shelby stood paralyzed, her face a mask of ruined perfection. She looked at Trevor, waiting for him to defend her, to laugh it off, to demand I be removed. But Trevor did not look at her. He pushed his chair back and stood up slowly. His face was not red with anger. It was pale with a sudden, terrifying clarity. He adjusted his cufflinks, a reflex of a man trying to regain control in a room spinning out of orbit. He walked past his weeping bride and stopped directly in front of me. He asked the only question that actually mattered. He asked, "Grace, who did you marry?" I met his gaze evenly. I did not need a microphone for this. I said, "Zachary Sterling." The name hit the room like a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, the kind of sound you hear when a high-wire artist slips. In Chicago, medical and financial circles, the name Sterling is not just a name, it is an institution. It means hospitals' wings, research grants, and the kind of venture capital that decides which biotech startups survive and which ones starve. Trevor closed his eyes for a moment, as if a migraine had just bloomed behind them. When he opened them, he looked at my parents, who were staring at me with the blank comprehension of people watching their house burn down. He said, "Zachary Sterling is my cousin. He is the managing partner of the venture firm that holds the controlling interest in my family's pharmaceutical company." My father, Thomas, stood up, his napkin clutching in his hand like a white flag. He stammered, saying he didn't know, saying I never told them. Trevor ignored him. He turned to Shelby, who was now trembling, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. He spoke with a lethal calmness. He said, "Do you realize what you have done? Zachary was not just Grace's husband. He was the signatory for the $60 million merger my father has been negotiating for 2 years. The wedding gift Zachary sent, the one you never received because you shredded the invitation, was the final approval for that deal. It was contingent on family unity. It was a gesture of goodwill to welcome you into the fold." Trevor laughed then. A short, humorless sound. He looked at the shredder in the video, then back at Shelby. You didn't just shred an invitation, Shelby. You shredded the merger. You severed the connection to the very fortune you were trying to marry into. I watched the realization hit my sister. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. She had spent her life curating an image of wealth and access, obsessing over the appearance of power. She had treated me, the quiet surgeon, as a stain on her aesthetic. She never imagined that the sister she hid in the shadows was actually the gatekeeper to the kingdom she desperately wanted to enter. She had built a fortress to keep me out, never realizing she had locked herself out of her own future. Trevor did not yell. He did not cause a scene. He simply reached up, unpinned the white rose boutonniere from his lapel, and placed it on the table next to the shredded remains of Shelby's dignity. The gesture was final. He looked at Shelby, whose mascara was now running in dark streaks down her face, ruining the perfection she had spent hours creating. He told her, I cannot marry a liability. I cannot marry someone who destroys strategic alliances for sport. You didn't just hurt your sister, you hurt the business. And in my world, that is the only sin that matters. Shelby screamed then. It was a raw, ugly sound that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with loss of status. She lunged for him, grabbing his arm, begging him to listen, blaming me, blaming the stress, blaming everyone but herself. My father, Thomas, rushed forward to intervene, his face purple with exertion. He started bargaining, telling Trevor they could fix this, that they could call Zachary, that it was all a misunderstanding. But the room was already emptying. The elite guests, the hospital board members, the investors, the society matrons were quietly collecting their purses and signaling for their drivers. They knew a sinking ship when they saw one. The illusion of the Sterling-approved power couple had evaporated, leaving behind only the desperate grasping of social climbers who had been exposed. I watched them scramble. For years, my family had derived their self-worth from what they could display. They rented their status. They leased their importance. And now, the landlord had come to collect, and they were bankrupt. It was the illusion of power from an empty wallet. They thought money and connections made them invincible. But those things were external. When the external props were removed, there was no internal structure to hold them up, no integrity, no loyalty, just a hollow shell that collapsed under the weight of its own deception. My father turned on me then, his eyes wild. He demanded I fix it. He ordered me to call Zachary. He told me I owed them this, after everything they had done for me. I studied him, noting the desperate dilation of his pupils and the sweat beading on his upper lip. I realized I felt nothing. No fear, no guilt, no obligation. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my checkbook. I uncapped my pen. I wrote a check for $60,000. It was the estimated cost of this wedding, plus the hush money they had tried to bribe me with in the past to keep my distance from their high society events. I ripped the check out of the book. The sound was loud in the emptying hall. I held it up so he could see the amount, see that I could pay it without blinking. Then, I tore it in half, and then in half again. I let the pieces flutter down onto the table like confetti. I told him, I don't buy family, and you can't afford me anymore. I turned my back on them. I walked past Shelby, who was sobbing on the floor in her ruined dress. I walked past my mother, who was staring at the wall in shock. I walked out of the Crystal Conservatory and into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage behind me. The cool night air of Chicago felt like a baptism. I walked out of the Crystal Conservatory and saw Zachary leaning against his matte black sedan, scrolling on his phone. He looked up as I approached, his expression calm, devoid of the frantic energy I had just left behind. He did not ask what happened. He saw my face, saw the way I held myself, and he knew. He opened the passenger door for me, and I slid into the quiet leather interior. He handed me a travel mug of coffee black. No sugar, just the way I like it. We drove away in silence. I watched the city lights blur past the window, the skyline retreating into the distance. I thought about Shelby, sobbing on the floor. I thought about my parents, standing amidst the ruins of their social ambitions. I felt a pang of sadness, not for what I had lost, but for what I had never had. I grieved the family I deserved, the sister who should have protected me, the parents who should have been proud of me, but beneath the grief was a profound sense of relief. The weight of their expectations, their cruelty, their constant demands for my compliance, it was gone. I had cut the cord. 6 months later, my research was published in a major medical journal. I secured a new grant for my work on neural regeneration. My life was full of work that mattered, of colleagues who respected me, of a husband who saw me. One morning, a letter arrived at my lab. It was thick, creamy stationery, the kind my mother favored. I recognized Shelby's handwriting immediately. I didn't open it. I knew what it would say. It would be a plea for money, for connection, for forgiveness. It would be an attempt to pull me back into their orbit, to reset the cycle of abuse. I took the letter to the sink in the corner of the lab. I struck a match and held it to the corner of the envelope. I watched the paper curl and blacken, the words turning to ash before they could ever touch me. I let the charred remains fall into the sink and washed them away. I thought about what family really means. For years, I had been told that family is blood, that it is obligation, that it is enduring pain because you share DNA, but that is a lie. Family is not about who you are related to. It is about who shows up. It is about the people who celebrate your victories without jealousy, who hold you when you fall without judgment. Zachary is my family. My colleagues are my family. The patients whose lives I save are my family. I built a tribe of people who chose me, and I chose them back. I cut the bloodline to save the lifeline. If you've ever had to choose your peace over your bloodline, share this story. You are not alone.